Hi, and welcome back to Chapter 3. This week we're reading Chapters 3 and 4 from Intercultural Communication and Context. This Chapter 3, Culture, Communication, Context, and Power, continues to define some of the terms and set the parameters for what we're studying in this course. Learning objectives for this chapter include identifying 3 approaches to culture, defining communication, identifying and describing 9 cultural value orientations, describing how values influence communication, understanding how values influence behavior during conflicts, describe how communication can reinforce cultural beliefs and behavior, and explain how culture can function as resistance to dominant value systems. Explain the relationship between communication and context, describe the characteristics of power, and finally describe the relationship between communication and power. So what does all this mean? Here we go. In Chapter 2, we discussed the history of intercultural communication studies, examined 3 theoretical approaches, and outlined an integrated dialectical approach to intercultural communication. In other words, the way we are going to attempt to study and understand intercultural communication. Here we continue our discussion of the dialectical approach and identify 4 interrelated components or building blocks in understanding intercultural communication. So we're going to talk about defining culture, communication, context, and power, and how those concepts come into play when we talk about intercultural communication. So what is culture? Culture can be defined in many ways, of course, from a pattern of perceptions that influence communication to a site of contestation and conflict. In other words, culture can be kind of this thing we carry with us, this pattern of perceptions, the way we understand the world, our worldview. But it can also be thought as the thing in which we live, right? So that when we enter another culture, or somebody else enters our culture, it could be a site of contestation and conflict, right? Because there are many acceptable definitions of culture, and because it's a complex concept, it's important for people to reflect on the centrality of culture to their own interactions. So something you'll be doing this week is thinking about your own culture so that you better understand how your own culture influences your communication. Culture is often considered the core concept in intercultural communication, obviously, because intercultural, right, between cultures. Intercultural communication studies often focus on how cultural groups differ from one another, but we should remind ourselves that regardless of cultural backgrounds, people engage in many of the same daily activities and have many of the same wants and desires. All people eat, sleep, love, pursue friendships and romantic relationships, and want to be respected and loved by those who are important to them. So we're going to be interested not only in differences, but also in similarities and how those can be tools to improve intercultural communication. So starting with social science, think about culture as learned group-related perceptions. In other words, culture is something that is tied to a group of people, and that we as members of that culture learn what those perceptions are. Not in the way you would learn maybe in school, but instead learn through participation in that culture, right? So communication scholars from the social science paradigm, influenced by research in psychology, view culture as a set of learned group-related perceptions. Culture becomes a collective experience because it is shared with people who live in and experience the same social environments. Social scientists have emphasized the role of perception in cultural patterns. They contend that cultural patterns of thinking and meaning influence people's perceptual process, which in turn influence their behavior. In other words, that our culture creates patterns of thought that determine and influence how we think and understand and give meaning to the things we perceive, right? To the ways in which we interact in the world. So that ultimately, it not only defines our thinking, but also our behavior, what we do, and our communication, right? How we talk about things. So intercultural communication scholars who use a social science approach are most interested in identifying cultural differences in perception and behavior, and then trying to understand how these differences impact communication between individuals with varying backgrounds. So they want to understand what happens or what they think will happen. Remember that social scientists are interested not only in describing, but also in predicting behavior. So what will happen when people of different cultures come together to communicate. Once you have a model of that, then you can develop strategies to improve that intercultural communication. Interpretive definitions, remember, interpretive definitions are things like rhetoric and anthropology, thinking about patterns of communication behavior rather than group-related perceptions. So interpretive scholars influenced by anthropological studies also view culture as shared and learned, right? Something that is group-based. However, they tend to focus on contextual patterns of communication behavior rather than on group-related perceptions. So what does that mean? Well, according to communication scholar Phillipson's definition, culture refers to, quote, a socially constructed and historically transmitted pattern of symbols, meaning, premises, and rules. So think about, I think one of the easier ways to understand this at a basic level is to think about any kind of cultural institution. For example, a church. Churches are contexts in which groups of people come and not only learn kind of the ideas of the church, but there are also patterns of symbols, meaning, premises, and rules. In other words, there is some kind of service through which different ideas and practices and different symbols are repeated over and over again until they just become part of the people who are attending that church. And this is true then, if you think about it, for other institutions within a culture, but also for things that are non-institutional. In other words, we receive particular symbols and meanings, premises or ideas, and rules, how we're supposed to act, right, in our culture. And we get this through social construction, so how we live together and build that. And they are also historical. They carry down through the culture, through different generations of people. Phillipson's approach is through ethnography of communication, a common interpretive approach. These scholars look for symbolic meaning of verbal and nonverbal activities in an attempt to understand patterns and rules of communication. So if you take the practices in a Catholic church, for example, right, you might look at the Mass as something that can be interpreted not only for symbolic meaning of verbal or the things that are said, but also nonverbal activities and the way that people interact and move during, whether that is kneeling to pray, standing to pray, whether that is participating in particular rituals, right? Ethnography of communication scholar Donald Garbaugh suggests that it is best to reserve the concept of culture for patterns of symbolic action and meaning that are deeply felt, right? Things that really matter to people, commonly intelligible, that is, the people in the culture typically understand them, right? And widely accessible. That means that lots of people in the culture can and do participate. Patterns that are deeply felt are sensed collectively by members of the cultural group. Gathering around a coffee machine at work every morning, for example, could be a cultural pattern, but only if the activity holds symbolic significance or evokes feelings that extend beyond itself. Right? So just going into a coffee room, make yourself a coffee and leaving isn't significant, right? But if every morning a group of people in a workplace get together and use that coffee break as a time to build community within them, and it becomes part of their daily practice that holds meaning for them, then it might be a cultural pattern that we should study, right? Culture is not only experienced as perception of values and contextual, but the concept of culture also involves emotion. So one way that interpretive definitions are different is, unlike social science, which attempts to remain somewhat objective, we are particularly interested in emotion here. So when people are in their own cultural surroundings, they feel a sense of familiarity and a certain level of comfort in the space, behavior, and actions of others, right? So when we feel at home, right, is a kind of a common expression, somewhere else, right, it is because we have established a context in that cultural surroundings that we feel that level of familiarity, right? One can characterize this feeling as a kind of embodied ethnocentrism, which is normal. This aspect of culture has implications for understanding adaptation to cultural norms and spaces as we encounter different cultures, right? So some people will perhaps easily adapt to certain cultural practices that are new to them, and some people will find them very off-putting or resist them. And that can have to do with how those emotional responses happen for people as they encounter cultures that are different from their own. So the stronger one's identification is with a particular space or cultural situation, the more difficult it might be to change spaces without experiencing a lot of discomfort. And this can be actual psychological and physiological changes, right? So imagine that you grow up in a community that is very matriarchal, that is female dominated, and then you have to shift because you move for work or something to a place that is very patriarchal or male dominated. Well, those are, if you were really comfortable in that matriarchal space, that shift is dramatic enough that it might be really difficult for you to adapt to this different culture that is so significantly different. Finally, critical definitions. Culture is heterogeneous, dynamic, and as a contested zone. So the first two, we noticed that they're both about kind of looking at the differences between cultures, right? In this case, we're talking about culture as a thing. Culture is heterogeneous, that is, culture that is not homogeneous or all the same, right? Not all the members are exactly the same. They're heterogeneous. You can have different groups within a larger culture who are different in lots of ways. It is dynamic, and it is this, we're going to talk about a contested zone. So a more recent approach to culture, influenced by cultural studies scholarship, emphasizes the heterogeneity of cultural groups and the often conflictual nature of cultural boundaries. Critical scholars suggest that in emphasizing only the shared aspects of culture, people gloss over the many interesting differences among U.S. Americans. Right? So there are lots of people who are part of American culture who are obviously very different, right? Further, they emphasize that cultural boundaries are often contested and not easily agreed upon. In other words, the place where people are included or excluded, the boundaries of a culture, right, are often contested, right? So we see new people being included sometimes and other people being excluded. So there's not a fixed boundary around your culture. It says these are the people who belong in this culture and the things they all believe, right? But instead, what counts as part of this culture and not part of this culture, and who is part of this culture and not part of this culture, can be argued over, and there could be conflicting views of that within the same culture. The notion of culture is heterogeneous and often conflictual, originated with British cultural studies scholars in the 1960s. Cultural studies scholars were fiercely interdisciplinary and dedicated to understanding the richness, complexity, and relevance of cultural phenomena in the lives of ordinary people. This desire to make academic work relevant to everyday life resonated in other fields. Viewing culture as a contested site or zone helps people understand the various struggles of groups like Native Americans, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, African Americans, Latino, Latinas, Latinx, women, gays and lesbians, transgender individuals, working class people, and so on. They attempt to negotiate their relationships and promote their well-being within the U.S. society, right? So all of these groups of people are part of a larger American culture, but they are not always wholly included or wholly excluded from what it means to be quote-unquote American, and may find that being quote-unquote American is not representative of the way they view their own cultures, right? So viewing culture as a contested site opens up new ways of thinking about intercultural communication. So remember, originally intercultural communication was about going to different countries and experiencing different people, right? But we recognize that within cultural groups, there can be other cultural groups, right? So American culture, as this broad general term, can incorporate a lot of very different people who are parts of very different cultures. And within there, they're trying to define their own cultures at very different levels, right? After all, the individuals in a given culture are not identical, which suggests that any culture is replete with cultural struggles, right? This can even happen in a family culture where an individual feels that they are not part of or represented by the culture of that family, right? They're the outsider in their family, the black sheep. Also, by viewing any culture as a contested zone or site of struggle, one can understand the complexities of that culture. In other words, cultures are not monolithic things that kind of dominate us, um, but are these complex things. Uh, one that we have to that we deal with on a day-to-day basis in our actual living, right? So it's not this kind of imagined superstructure that defines who we are at every point, but instead is this um, collection of ideas and practices, right? Rules, guidelines that influence how we live, that we can either follow because that's what we've always done in our culture, right? Or resist because it doesn't seem to work for that particular individual in that particular context, right? So that's culture. What is communication? Well, communication is as complex as culture and can be defined in many different ways. The defining characteristic of communication is meaning, and one could say that communication occurs whenever someone attributes meaning to another person's words or actions. This is an interesting concept or definition because the communication in this case is not about the speaker or the writer or the creator, but is instead about the audience or the person who receives those words and attributes meaning. Communication may be understood as a, quote, symbolic process whereby reality is produced, maintained, repaired, and transformed. In other words, communication is a way in which culture, right, it's a symbolic process, in which culture kind of defines our reality, right? The social science perspective emphasizes the various components of communication. There is a sender receiver, a message, a channel, and a context, right? Sender receiver, the person who creates the message and receives the message. The message itself, the channel or the media through which that message is communicated, and the context in which the message is created and received and then replicated down the road, right? The interpretive perspective emphasizes the symbolic processual nature of communication. Processual, it's a process, right? The communication is a process and it's symbolic. It has meaning. The symbolic nature of communication means that the words people speak or gestures they make have no inherent meaning. Rather, they gain their significance from an agreed upon meaning. So imagine if I give you a thumbs up, right? Because I want to tell you a good job. It only works if you understand that symbol to mean good job. In some cultures, that is actually like in America giving the middle finger. So it would not be a respectful gesture at all. Um, and that can be true, though, of words as well, okay? That is that we have to understand the intended message and interpret it and assign it meaning, in other words, and actually to have some kind of communication. So sometimes it's a process through which we kind of negotiate. Well, what do you really mean? What do I really understand? Until we figure out how to work together. The interpretive perspective also emphasizes that the process by which people negotiate meaning is dynamic. Communication is not a singular event, but it's ongoing, right? Just like I said, right? That when we communicate, it's a negotiation between the two people or the two groups or a whole big group of individuals, right, who are trying to communicate with one another. It relies on communication events to make sense, right? So you say something, I hear it, I respond, you hear it, and we go kind of back and forth like that in its most basic situation, right? The critical perspective then emphasizes the importance of societal forces in the communication process. That is, that all voices and symbols are not equal, but are arranged in a social hierarchy in which some individual characteristics are more highly valued than others. In other words, which voices are most respected in a particular context? What happens to those other voices, right? And those contexts and who is valued in those contexts can vary dramatically, even within a single culture, depending on specific contexts, right? So what is the relationship between culture and communication then? What we're interested here is the relationship between culture and communication, which of course is complex. A dialectical perspective assumes that culture and communication are interrelated and reciprocal. That is, they are related to one another and they're reciprocal. They impact or influence one another constantly. That is, culture influences communication and vice versa. Here we will consider 3 questions about relationship between culture and communication. First, what we're most interested in this case, how does culture influence communication? 2, how does communication reinforce culture? And 3, how can communication work as resistance to the dominant cultural system? You'll see those last 2 questions are kind of opposite sides of the same coin, right? How does communication reinforce culture? And how can it be resistant to culture? Okay, so just really quickly, how culture influences communication. Intercultural communication scholars use broad frameworks from anthropology and psychology to identify and study cultural differences in communication. So, what are frameworks? Well, frameworks are these perspectives we use as scholars to try to understand intercultural communication. If you've ever done literary studies, you'll know that oftentimes we take a theory and apply it to a particular text. Well, it's the same idea, where we take this concept that we believe is a way to understand and define communication and apply that to intercultural communication in our studies. So, for example, researchers Florence Kluckong and Fred Strodbeck emphasize the centrality of cultural values and understanding cultural groups. Values are the most deeply felt beliefs shared by a cultural group, and they reflect a shared perception of what ought to be and not what is. They suggest that members of all cultural groups then must answer the following important questions. Now, it's important. Scholars don't believe that we actually sit around all day going, well, I wonder how to answer this question for my culture. But instead, these are kind of ways to think about, or frameworks through which we can understand the internal questions that members of a culture might hold answers to that influence then their communication, right? So what is human nature? Is it essentially good, a combination of good and evil, or is it essentially evil? Well, that determines a lot about how we interact with people, right? Whether we believe them to be essentially good or essentially evil or some mix in between. What is the relationship between humans and nature? So think about, should humans dominate nature, live in harmony with nature, or be dominated by nature? That is, what is our relationship to our context, right? What is the relationship between humans? In other words, how are we supposed to be as groups? Are we more individualistic or more collectivist? Remember, we've talked about in previous examples how Americans tend to understand themselves as more individualistic, whereas some other cultures, like Japanese culture, might be more collectivist. What is the preferred personality or activity value? Should we focus on doing, growing, or being? Right? So if you think about it, if you're a culture who defines themselves very much by their professions, you are probably a doing culture. If you are a culture who defines yourself through terms of constant progress or becoming, right? You're a growing culture. And if you are part of a culture that attempts to stay kind of present in the moment, you might be a being culture, right? You are, right? And then finally, what is the orientation toward time? Do we emphasize the past, the present, or the future? One way to think about political cultures in America, for example, is that the more conservative cultures tend to look backwards, right, at the values that were held by the Americans before now and how we need to recuperate that. Think about Donald Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," right? This is about bringing the past back to the present, right? The present, which would mean focusing on addressing issues right here, right now, solving like immediate crises, or the future, which if you look on a more progressive side, right, it's interested in progress and where we want to get, right, in this kind of like anything new is good perspective, right? And think about that. For example, and people are really highly interested in technology, right? It's not always about it's about looking forward, not about what's happening right now, right? We have a particular problem right now, but in the future, we're also going to need to be aware of this problem and how are we going to address that. So some other cultural value dimensions for frameworks that you should be aware of. Power distance refers to the extent to which less powerful members of institutions or organizations within a country expect and accept the unequal distribution of power. In other words, how far away do minority cultures find themselves or identify themselves in relationship to majority cultures in a particular distribution of power? And also, though, how commonly is that accepted and expected? So part of this is about, right, it's very much about the relationship between majority cultures and minority cultures and how much minority cultures are excluded or marginalized, pushed to the margins from participation in dominant culture and the institutions of dominant culture. We can see this in the United States with segregation of schools, for example, that we were in a situation where legally all non-white students were forced physically, right, excluded from majority culture education systems and given separate educational systems. And that became accepted and expected because the minority cultures did not feel capable for a long time of really contesting that, right? And it took, even after Brown versus Board of Education, which decided that separate was inherently unequal, it still took 21 years, for example, in Natchitoches Parish for schools to integrate. So we see how that power distance can be manifest in kind of physical institutions. The masculinity femininity values is two-dimensional. It refers to the degree to which gender-specific roles are valued, right? So in a particular culture, are there very clear gender-specific rules, and how important is that to how we understand who is a woman and who is a man, or who is masculine and who is feminine? And number two, the degree to which culture groups value so-called masculine values or so-called feminine values. What are the dominant or preferred values in particular contexts? And you can see this historically when women were excluded from particular levels of management or leadership positions because so-called feminine values were not valued in those contexts. Uncertainty avoidance concerns the degree to which people who feel threatened by ambiguous situations respond by avoiding them or trying to establish more structure to compensate for the uncertainty. So some cultures kind of thrive in moments of uncertainty, and they tend to have cultures that have fewer laws and rules about how each individual is supposed to act. And some cultures search out certainty and therefore have lots of rules and laws and guidelines to define how people can or cannot act in a particular society. If you think about tyrannical situations, right, we have one leader who exercises a tremendous amount of influence and dominance over an entire group. There is a huge desire to avoid uncertainty. So that leader, in order to maintain control, is going to create a lot of rules and guidelines and laws and that force people to act in particular ways that will protect that system of governance. Long-term versus short-term orientation reflects a society's search for virtue or truth. Long-term means that we are interested in kind of making small steps towards a greater, bigger truth. Short-term means wanting to kind of understand our truths now in the moment, that they are things that clearly exist and we can understand and interpret and apply in our lives, right? So one is about long-term progress, and the other is about kind of having the in the now belief in what is true or virtuous. Recent studies suggest there is now an additional value dimension, one that hasn't been studied a lot up to this point, but indulgence versus restraint, and that is how indulgent is a culture and how much they value things like restraints, this ability to kind of to say no and self-control, right? Versus this desire to kind of just go out all out and enjoy everything, right? And this kind of balance, where does each culture kind of fall, where are their values related to this? So identifying cultural values helps people understand broad cultural differences, but it is important to remember that not everyone in a given society holds the dominant value, right? So you might be part of the dominant culture in a lot of ways, but it doesn't mean you agree with everything that that your broad culture identifies with. We see this in democracies where people who generally believe the same big concepts maybe differ significantly in the ways in which those concepts are achieved or understood. Another limitation of value frameworks is they tend to essentialize people. In other words, people tend to assume that a particular group is characteristic. A particular group characteristic is the essential characteristic of a given member at all times in all contexts, right? So if one person cannot adequately speak for all the people in one culture, and general broad ideas about that culture, which may be true statistically about that culture at a larger scale, may not be true of every individual member of that culture, right? So we just have to remember that. The differences, similarities dialectic reminds one that although people may differ with respect to specific value orientations, they also may hold other value orientations in common. So how does communication reinforce culture? Communication, our culture not only influences communication, but is also enacted through, and so is influenced by communication. Scholars of cultural communication describe how various aspects of culture are enacted in speech communities in situ, that is, in contexts. They seek to understand communication patterns that are situated socially and give voice to cultural identity. Using an ethnography of communication approach, researcher Craig Engstrom examined how patterns of talk about drinking alcohol shape and reinforce notions of masculinity and gender identity among U.S. college students. He concluded that in order to be seen as a competent communicator in this speech community, male students had to portray drinking as a normal behavior and follow several communication rules. Rule 1. Refer to alcohol consumption in a non-numeric and abstract way. Never say exactly how much was drunk, and one should not ask specifically how much was consumed. Rule 2. Refer to alcohol positively. One should not make negative statements about alcohol consumption, even when there was clearly an alcohol-related tragedy. Rule 3. Refer to alcohol consumption as normal. So what we see is, right, that even that there are cultures, right, obviously within cultures, that could be built around particularly symbolic patterns of behavior like alcohol consumption, right? There another example, a related approach from cultural communication studies sees culture as performative, as something you perform, you do. Several Latina communication scholars have described in autoethnographies, writing about their own experiences, how they each perform their ethnic identities in various contexts. And they emphasize that being Latino is never just one thing. There are multiple contingent and overlapping ways to experience and articulate Latino identity. They show that individuals in the same cultural category may share some similarities, but also view and perform their identities in very different ways. And I'm sure if you think about your own relationship as an individual within the variety of cultures of which you are a part, you will see that you are similar to and different from other members in those groups. So then, if it does, though, reinforce kind of what it means to be, right? What's a true Latino experience, for example. It can also be a way to resist dominant culture in the way you're defined within your culture. So resistance is the metaphor used in cultural studies to conceptualize the relationship between culture and communication. For example, workers can find ways to resist the authority structure of management and extreme competition in many ways. Some subtle, like work slowdowns, and some more obvious, like whistleblowing, right? Turning people in when they when turning a company in when it violates some kind of law or policy. Social media has dramatically increased the efficacy and the efficiency of resistance. For example, a Facebook post and then a tweet, Black Lives Matter, after the murder of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown by white police officers gathered momentum, which then led thousands to communicate their resistance against perceived injustices and institutionalized racism, right? So, minority cultures and cultures who are oppressed by majority cultures can use communication, right, in a workplace setting, in a social setting, to work with other people in this minority group, right, to oppose or resist the dominant culture. What is the relationship between communication and context then? Well, context is typically created by the physical, virtual, or social aspects of the situation in which communication occurs. In other words, communication occurs somewhere and between certain groups or people, individuals. So how does that context interpret or influence how we communicate? I mean, think about how differently you might communicate with your best friend, with your grandmother, when you're in church, when you're at school, when you're at work, right? You can have very different styles of communication based on context. So context is neither static nor objective. In other words, context is dynamic, it changes, and it's subjective. It has to do with how we understand the situations we're in and how other people understand the situations they're in as we communicate. It can also be multi-layered, right? So just like the idea of culture is multi-layered, context can be multi-layered. There can be aspects of context that lay on top of one another to make it more and more complex. Context may consist of the social, political, and historical structures in which communication occurs. You can imagine in South Africa, for example, after the lifting of apartheid, how much those social, political, and historical structures of apartheid still influenced the ability of white and black South Africans to work and communicate together. Not surprisingly, the social context is determined on the societal level. The political context in which the communication occurs, whether online or face-to-face, includes those forces that attempt to change or retain existing social structures and relationships. People also need to examine the historical context of communication, right? History always matters, as we'll see in our next chapter. Finally, what is the relationship between communication and power? Well, power is pervasive in communication interactions, although it is not always evident or obvious how power influences communication or what kinds of meaning are constructed. So this can be obvious situations, for example, in a workplace where a boss has built-in power over his or her employees, or in an educational system, the relationship between a professor and a student, but can also have to do with social and political and historical contexts in which we live, right? Communication scholar Mark Orby describes how people in power, consciously or unconsciously, that's important, right? People aren't always aware of the power structure, create and maintain communication systems that reflect, reinforce, and promote their own ways of thinking and communicating. In other words, their own values. Dominant communication systems ultimately impede those who do not share the systems. There are two levels of group-related power, according to Orby. The primary dimensions, things like age, older people tend to have more authority in most cultures. Ethnicity, there tends to be a dominant ethnicity. Gender, there seems to be a preferred gender sexuality value system. Physical ability, this is the case where people with physical disabilities are oftentimes excluded and marginalized in cultures. Race, once again, there tends to be in cultures a preferred dominant race, and sexual orientation, right? So these are kind of things that are more permanent in nature, right? There are things that they are, right? They're part of who we are and part of how we understand the world, right? And these can have to do with those values we talked about earlier. The secondary dimensions, things like educational background, geographic location, marital status, and socioeconomic status, are more changeable, though not always. We'll talk about that later in the class, because people tend to end up, in many cultures, staying exactly where their previous generations of their families were in terms of these issues. Power also comes from social institutions and the roles that individuals occupy in those institutions. Power is complex, especially in relation to institutions or the social structure. Some inequities, such as gender, class, or race, are more rigid than those created by temporary roles such as student or teacher, right? So the student-teacher dynamic only works for as long as the student is the student of that teacher. Once that student is graduated, that dynamic changes. But people don't tend to change some of these other categories, right, or more permanent. Power is dynamic. It is not a simple one-way proposition. Dominant cultural groups attempt to perpetuate positions of privilege in many ways. However, subordinate groups can resist this domination in many ways too. Cultural groups can use political and legal means to maintain or resist domination, as in the U.S. women's soccer team's lawsuit for pay equity, or pay equality, it's not equity, with the men's team, accompanied by lots of protests at the last World Cup and gaining support from sponsors. Groups can negotiate their various relations to culture through economic boycotts and strikes. A dialectical perspective looks at the dynamic and interrelated ways in which culture, communication, context, and power intersect in intercultural communication interactions. From a communication perspective, it might not be at all clear that an intercultural struggle had taken place. From a cultural perspective, however, with various contexts and power differentials in mind, a different view of this intercultural interaction emerges. So that's chapter 3. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm here to help.